The paper was delivered on October 12, 1888, by a young man from the Gilded Spur Mining Company, whose coat was too thin for the coming winter. He held the envelope in a gloved hand, his knuckles white with either cold or nervousness. Clara stood in the doorway of the small house she had shared with her husband, Elias, for 7 years, the chill from the threshold creeping through the floorboards. The house sat at 9,200 feet, just outside the struggling settlement of Argent, Colorado, and the air already had the sharp, metallic bite of impending snow. "Mrs. Holloway?" the young man asked. His name was Davies. She knew him from town, knew his father ran the assay office. "I am," she said. Her voice was steady. It had been steady for the 4 months since the rockfall in the north shaft had taken Elias from her. It had been her anchor. He extended the envelope. "This is from Mr. Thorne, the superintendent. It's a formal notice." Clara took it. The paper was crisp, the company letterhead embossed at the top. She did not need to open it to know what it was. The whispers had been circulating in Argent for weeks. Gilded Spur had bought up the prospectors' claims all along Sentinel Ridge, consolidating their hold. The company houses, of which hers was one, were being reclaimed for contracted engineers and foremen arriving from the east. Elias had never been a company man in that way. He had been a geologist, they consulted, a man who worked on his own terms, and they had let him have the house as part of his fee. That contract, it seemed, had died with him. She slit the envelope open with her thumb. The language was legal and impenetrable, but the essential facts were clear. The property was to be vacated within 14 days. A settlement of $65 would be paid upon her departure for the relinquishment of any further claim. $65. It was an insult presented as a courtesy. It was the price of a decent saddle, or perhaps 4 months' worth of flour and salt pork. It was not the price of a life. "The company regrets the necessity of this action," Davies said, reciting a line he had clearly been told to memorize. He could not quite meet her eyes, his gaze fixed on the worn planking of her porch. "Mr. Thorne felt it was important to provide a settlement to assist with your relocation." Clara folded the paper and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. She looked past the boy, to the towering gray granite of Sentinel Ridge, its peaks already dusted with the first snows. The ponderosa pines stood dark and unmoving against the pale sky. She had loved this view. Elias had taught her the name of every peak, every formation. He had read the land like a book, and she had learned to read it with him. "Tell Mr. Thorne I have received his notice," she said. Her composure was a wall, smooth and solid. She would not give this boy, or the company he represented, the satisfaction of her tears. Grief was a private matter. This was business. A cold, cruel transaction written on a piece of paper. Davies nodded, relieved. "Yes, ma'am, I will." He turned to leave, his boots crunching on the thin layer of frost that had formed in the shadows. He paused at the gate. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm sorry for your trouble." "Trouble is a part of life, Mr. Davies," she replied, her voice even. "It is the handling of it that matters." She closed the door before he was fully gone, the latch clicking shut with a sound of finality. She stood for a long moment in the sudden quiet of the house, the ticking of the mantel clock the only sound. The house was filled with Elias, his rock hammer by the hearth, his worn geology texts on the shelf, the faint scent of pipe tobacco that clung to the curtains. In 14 days, all of it would be gone. She walked to the window and looked out at the ridge again. The sun was low, casting long, sharp shadows that looked like grasping fingers. Winter was not coming. It was here, and she was to be turned out into it, with $65 and the memory of a man who knew how to read the stone. She did not weep. The time for weeping was past. The time for calculation had begun. Later that evening, Clara sat at the kitchen table, the source of all her domestic planning, and laid out the facts of her existence as if they were sums in a ledger. On one side of a piece of foolscap, she wrote, "Assets." The first entry was the company's offer, $65. Beneath it, she added her own savings, scraped together from selling eggs and mending clothes for the miners' wives. That sum was $22.40. Her total capital was $87.40. She owned a sturdy horse, a 10-year-old mare named Juniper, and a good saddle. She had her husband's tools, his books, her own household goods, and the clothes on her back. These were the material facts. On the other side of the page, she wrote, "Liabilities." At the top of the list, she wrote her age, 35. Not old, but not young. Too old to be hired easily as a domestic in a town like Denver, where younger, stronger girls were plentiful and cheaper. She had no family to turn to. Her parents were buried in a churchyard in Ohio, and her only brother had gone to California years ago, his letters stopping 2 winters past. She was alone. Below that she wrote, "Winter." In Argent, this was not a season but a siege. Snows began in October and did not melt for good until May. Temperatures regularly fell to 20, sometimes 30 degrees below zero. Fuel was life, and firewood was expensive if you could not cut it yourself from a permitted plot, which she no longer had. She began to calculate her options, listing them and striking them through one by one. She could take the stagecoach to Denver. The ticket alone would be $15. A room in a respectable boarding house would be at least $4 a week, and that was without meals. Her $87 would be gone in less than 4 months, and that presumed she found no work. Finding work was the great uncertainty. She was a good seamstress, a capable cook, and she could keep accounts. But dozens of other women in Denver possessed the same skills. She would be one more widow in a city that had little use for them. She could attempt to stay in Argent, but where? The only boarding house was full of company men. Renting a room from a family was a possibility, but her funds were too limited. She would be a charity case by January. The thought was intolerable. She had never taken charity in her life, and she would not start now. The work available in Argent was tied to the mine. Laundry, cooking, cleaning, all for the men of the Gilded Spur. She could not bring herself to wash the clothes or cook the meals for the company that had so casually and completely erased her life. It was not a matter of pride, but of a deeper, colder principle. She would not serve them. The arithmetic was unforgiving. Her assets were finite, her liabilities immense. The world had presented her with a problem that, by conventional means, had no solution. She would be destitute by midwinter, either in a cold Denver tenement or a drafty room in Argent, dependent on the meager kindness of strangers. She looked at the numbers on the page, the stark accounting of her life, the neat columns, the precise figures. This was the language the company understood. It was the language of profit and loss, of assets and liabilities. And by their calculation, she was a liability to be disposed of. She stared out the window into the deep, star-filled black of the mountain night. The wind was rising, a low moan through the pines. It was a sound that had once been comforting, the sound of a storm coming while she was safe inside, the stove warm Elias across the table from her. Now it sounded like a threat. For the first time since Davies had come to her door, a tremor of genuine fear ran through her. It was a cold, clean fear, as sharp as an icicle. It was the fear of a creature about to be left to the elements. She drew a deep breath, letting the cold air from the window pane steady her. Self-pity was a luxury, as unaffordable as a train ticket to a place she did not know. It was a waste of energy. What she needed was not a solution that fit the world's rules, but one that ignored them entirely. She needed a different kind of inheritance. Her gaze fell upon the bookshelf by the hearth, on the row of Elias's journals. They were leather-bound ledgers, filled with his precise, angular handwriting, detailing years of walking these mountains. They were filled with measurements, geological observations, and sketches of rock formations. The world saw them as the notebooks of a dead prospector. She had always seen them as a record of a life lived with extraordinary attention. He had left her no money, no property in his name. But perhaps, she thought, he had left her something else. Clara spent the next 2 days methodically packing her life into crates and trunks. She sorted what she would sell, what she would keep, and what she would leave behind. It was a task of unsentimental triage. The rocking chair her mother had given her, sell. Her wedding china, leave. Elias's tools, his books, her warmest clothes, and a store of dry goods, keep. Amidst this careful dismantling of her home, she reserved the evenings for Elias's journals. She sat by the fire, a mug of weak tea in her hand, and began to read. She started with the most recent and worked her way back. Much of it was technical, filled with terms like igneous intrusion, schistosity, and pegmatite dikes. But woven between the scientific observations were Elias's own thoughts, his appreciation for the stark beauty of the high country. He described the way the light hit a particular rock face at dawn, the taste of water from a hidden spring, the silence of a snow-filled forest. It was like hearing his voice again, calm and patient, teaching her to see. On the second night, working through a journal from 2 years prior, dated August 1886, her fingers stilled on a particular page. The entry was titled, simply, Sentinel Ridge, South Face. He described a survey he had conducted on his own time, exploring a section of the ridge the mining companies had ignored, deeming it geologically unpromising. He wrote of a granite overhang, a natural rock shelter hidden by a stand of old-growth aspen and a significant scree slope. The formation is unimpressive from a distance, he had written in his neat, sloping script. But the interior is remarkable. A chamber roughly 20 feet across and 12 deep, with a ceiling height of nearly 9 feet at the mouth, sloping down to 5 at the back. The entrance faces due south, a perfect orientation for passive solar gain in winter. The mass of the granite overhead would provide exceptional thermal insulation. A vertical fissure at the rear could serve as a natural chimney. Clara leaned closer to the lamplight, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. He had drawn a small, detailed sketch of the overhang's layout. He noted the dry floor, the good drainage of the surrounding slope, and the presence of a small, protected nook on the east side, out of the prevailing wind. It was not a prospector's assessment of mineral wealth. It was an engineer's assessment of shelter. And then she saw the final paragraph, written almost as an afterthought. Called it Elias's folly to myself. No gold, no silver to speak of, though I noted a curious quartz intrusion veined with what looked to be high-grade argentite near the western wall. Not enough to warrant a claim, a pocket too small for a company to bother with, but a geological curiosity. The real value of the place is not what's in the rock, but the rock itself. A man could winter there, if he had the will. She read the line again. A man could winter there, if he had the will. He hadn't been writing about himself. Elias had loved this house, their life together. He had been making an observation, a geologist's note on the properties of the land. He could not have known that he was leaving her a map, a key, an inheritance far more valuable than a deed or a bank account. He was leaving her knowledge. He was leaving her a place. The cruelty of the gilded spur had left her with nothing, but Elias, in his quiet, methodical way, had left her everything she needed. She closed the journal and held it to her chest. The fear she had felt the night before was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. The world had offered her a set of unacceptable choices. She would now choose her own. She would not go to Denver. She would not beg for a room in Argent. She would take her $87 and her husband's knowledge, and she would go to the one place that was left to her. She would go to Elias's Folly. The name was a misnomer. It was not a folly. It was her salvation. She was not a man, but she had the will. She had to. It was all she had left. The next morning, Clara loaded Juniper with a pickaxe, a shovel, a small canvas sack of food, and Elias's journal. She left the house unlocked, the crates of her belongings stacked neatly on the porch for the wagon she would hire later. She did not look back. The expedition to Sentinel Ridge was a 4-mile walk, gaining nearly 1,000 feet in elevation. The trail was steep and poorly marked, a path used more by deer than by men. Juniper, sure-footed and patient, picked her way through the fallen timber and slick patches of early ice. Clara followed the directions Elias had sketched from memory, supplemented by the detailed notes in his journal. She crossed Argent Creek at the shallow ford he'd described, then began the ascent up the south-facing slope. The air grew thinner, cleaner. The sun was bright, but it held no warmth. She moved with a steady, unhurried pace, conserving her energy. The work ahead would require all of it. After 2 hours of climbing, she found the stand of old-growth aspens, their white trunks skeletal against the deep blue of the sky. Just beyond them, as the journal had promised, was a steep, scree slope, a cascade of loose rock that made the approach treacherous. She tethered Juniper to a sturdy pine and made the final 100 yards on foot, testing each foothold before putting her weight down. The entrance was exactly where he'd said it would be, almost completely concealed by a curtain of rockfall and a few hardy, wind-stunted junipers. She pushed aside a loose slab of granite and stepped inside. The air was still and cold, but noticeably less biting than the wind outside. It smelled of dry dust and stone. The light from the southern entrance illuminated a space that was both larger and more promising than she had dared to hope. She paced it off. 20 feet wide at the mouth, tapering slightly. 12, maybe 13 feet deep. The ceiling, a massive, solid slab of granite, was high enough for her to stand upright without stooping, even at the back. The floor was packed earth and gravel, remarkably level and dry. She ran her hand along the back wall. It was cold to the touch, a vast reservoir of stone. Elias's words came back to her. Exceptional thermal insulation. The granite would absorb heat from the sun, from a stove, and radiate it back slowly, a bulwark against the sub-zero nights. She found the vertical fissure he had mentioned, a crack running from the floor up through the ceiling, a perfect flue. She looked at the south-facing entrance. For at least 6 hours a day, even in the depths of winter, sunlight would pour directly into the chamber, warming the stone, providing light. This was not a cave. It was a foundation. It was a structure waiting to be completed. She walked to the western wall and after a moment of searching, found it. A thick, milky white vein of quartz, shot through with glittering black threads. Argentite. Silver ore. Elias's geological curiosity. It was beautiful. A dark lightning bolt frozen in the stone. She touched it, the rock cold and solid under her palm. It was a reminder of him, of his eye for the hidden value in things. Clara stood in the center of the space, turning a slow circle. She could see it all in her mind. A low stone wall enclosing the front, with a space for a door and a small window. A stove set against the back wall, its pipe venting up through the fissure. A bed built against the eastern wall, protected from drafts. A space for juniper, a small lean-to against the outer wall. Wood stacked high and dry against the interior. This could work. This could actually work. It would be brutally hard labor, a race against the first heavy snow, but it was possible. For the first time in months, a feeling that was not grief or fear or grim determination settled in her. It was a quiet, fierce spark of hope. She had not been cast out. She had been given a new starting point. This place, Elias's Folly, would be her fortress. The following day, Clara rode Juniper into Argent, her face set with a purpose that left no room for questions. She hitched the mare outside Porter's Mercantile, the largest and best-stocked store in the settlement. Silas Porter was a man in his late 60s, with a fringe of white hair and hands permanently stained from 100 different commodities. He had been a friend of Elias's, the two of them often sharing a pipe on the store's front porch in the evenings, talking about geology and the unforgiving nature of the mountains. He had offered his condolences after the accident, his words simple and sincere. Clara walked in, the bell above the door announcing her arrival. The store smelled of canvas, coffee, and coal oil. She had a list, written out on the back of a receipt. She did not waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Porter," she said, her voice clear and direct, "I need to purchase some supplies." He leaned on the counter, his expression one of polite inquiry. "Of course, Clara. Whatever you need." She began to read from her list, and with each item, his eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch higher. 1 good shovel, a pickaxe, the heavy one, a 10-pound sledge, a handsaw, 20 pounds of 10-penny nails, 200 feet of rope, a cast-iron prospector's stove, the small one with the flat top, 20 feet of stovepipe and an elbow joint, a 50-pound sack of flour, 20 pounds of beans, 10 pounds of salt pork, 5 pounds of coffee, a large canvas tarp, the heaviest you have. She paused, mentally tallying the cost. It would take nearly all of her money. Silas Porter said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the list, then at her face. He saw no desperation there, only resolve. He was a man who had lived in the high country his entire life. He recognized the look of someone preparing for a long winter, but this was different. This was not stocking a cabin. This was building one from scratch, or something close to it. He did not ask her where she was going. He did not mention the eviction notice, though the news was all over town. He simply respected the hard line of her jaw and the clarity in her eyes. "The shovel will be $4, he said, his voice practical. "Pickaxe is $3, the stove is $12, and the pipe will run you another $3. All told, with the provisions, it will come to $68.50. It was more than the company's entire settlement. It was the majority of her capital. "I'll also need a wagon to haul it, and my things from the house," she said. "As far as the Argent Creek Ford." "Another $5, he said, already moving to gather the items. "I'll have my boy Henry load it up." As she counted out the money onto the worn wooden counter, Silas paused. He went into the back room and returned with a small wooden crate. Lantern wicks, a full tin of kerosene, 2 bars of lye soap, and a box of sulfur matches. No charge. He then picked up a heavy sack from beside the door. And this, 100 pounds of oats for the mare, on the house. A winter is hard on man and beast. Clara looked at him, her throat tightening for the first time. It was a small kindness, but it felt immense. He was not offering pity. He was offering practical support, a professional courtesy from one survivor to another. He saw what she was attempting, and he was making a quiet investment in her success. "Thank you, Silas," she said, the words feeling inadequate. "Elias was a good man," he replied, as if that explained everything. He knew the difference between rock that pays and rock that holds. "Looks like you do too." He finished tallying her bill. "Henry will have the wagon ready in an hour. He'll help you load your crates." She nodded, took her receipt, and walked out into the cold, bright sunlight. She had spent nearly everything she had. Her $87 had been transformed into tools, food, and shelter. The transaction was complete. Now the labor would begin. The construction of her shelter was a relentless, punishing dialogue between her will and the unyielding realities of stone, timber, and gravity. For 34 consecutive days, from the first pale light of dawn until her muscles screamed in the violet dusk, Clara worked. She was not a carpenter or a stonemason, but she was Elias's student. He had taught her the principles of structure, of load-bearing, of finding the natural strength in materials. Her first task was to clear and prepare the site. She used the pickaxe and shovel to level the earthen floor of the shelter, removing loose rocks and creating a smooth, packed surface. She then cleared a wide area in front of the overhang, creating a workspace. The labor was grueling, each swing of the pick jarring her shoulders, each shovelful of rock a significant weight at that altitude. By the end of the first week, her hands were a geography of blisters and calluses, and every muscle in her back and arms ached with a deep, resonant fire. The heart of the project was the wall. She would enclose the 20-foot-wide entrance with a dry stack stone wall, leaving openings for a door and a small window. The raw material was abundant. The scree slope that concealed the shelter was a quarry of granite, weathered into manageable sizes. Her days took on a rhythm: gather, lift, place. She would spend hours selecting stones, looking for flat faces and stable shapes. She learned to read the rocks as Elias had, to see how they would fit together. She would haul them one by one to the building site, some so heavy she had to roll them into place. She built the wall 2 feet thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the top, creating a massive, solid barrier against the wind. It was a slow, monumental puzzle. Each stone had to be settled just so, chinked with smaller stones to eliminate gaps. She built it 4 feet high, a solid rampart against the coming snows. While the wall rose, she devoted part of each day to firewood. The slopes around her were littered with deadfall ponderosa pine and aspen, seasoned by years of dry mountain air. She used the handsaw to cut the logs into stove lengths, the rasp of the blade a steady percussion in the immense silence. She hauled the wood back to the shelter, stacking it against the interior back wall where it would stay dry. The growing woodpile was a visible measure of her security, a fortress within a fortress. She calculated her needs with cold precision. At a burn rate of roughly 1 cubic foot per day in the coldest weather, she would need at least 150 cubic feet to last until May. The pile grew, a monument to her foresight. For Juniper, she built a lean-to against the eastern exterior of the rock face, using scavenged pine logs for the frame and the heavy canvas tarp for a roof. It was a simple, three-sided structure that would protect the mare from the worst of the wind and snow. Juniper's quiet presence was a comfort, her soft nickering in the mornings a reminder that she was not entirely alone. The most technical task was installing the stove. She chose a spot near the back wall, directly beneath the vertical fissure Elias had noted. She built a raised hearth of flat stones to protect the floor, then wrestled the 100-pound iron stove into place. With Henry's help from the provisioning trip, she had hauled the stovepipe sections up the mountain. Now she fitted them together, running the pipe straight up into the fissure. She used a mixture of clay and small stones to seal the gaps around the pipe, creating a fire-safe, efficient chimney. On the 34th day, it was finished. The wall was built, the door framed with rough-hewn timber. A second canvas tarp hung as a temporary door. The stove was installed. The woodpile reached the ceiling. She had transformed a granite overhang into a home. That evening, as the first real snow of the season began to fall, she lit a fire in the stove for the first time. The small iron box glowed with heat, and the draft up the fissure worked perfectly, drawing the smoke cleanly out of the chamber. The massive granite walls began to absorb the warmth, a slow and steady transfer of energy. She sat on a crate, eating a bowl of beans, and watched the snow swirl outside her doorway. The temperature was dropping fast, but inside her stone house, it was warm and safe. She had done it. She had built her winter fortress. The first great test came in the third week of November. A storm, born in the far north, descended upon the Rockies with a brutal, single-minded fury. For 6 days, the world beyond her shelter disappeared into a white chaos of wind and snow. The temperature, which she tracked with a small thermometer hung by the door, plummeted to 25 degrees below zero and stayed there. The wind howled over the top of the ridge, a sound like a grieving animal, but inside her stone walls, it was only a distant murmur. Her life contracted to a series of deliberate, essential routines. Each morning, she would wake in the cold darkness before dawn, her breath pluming in the air. Her first act was always to tend the stove. She would add 3 logs of dry pine, their resinous wood catching quickly and burning hot, and wait for the warmth to push back the deep cold of the night. The small chamber would slowly warm to a livable 50 degrees. While the stove heated up, she would pull on her heavy coat and boots and push her way out through the canvas door. The snow had piled up against her wall, forming a deep drift that reached the top of the 4-foot stonework. She had to carve a trench to get out. The snow so light and cold, it squeaked under the shovel. This snow, she knew, was not an enemy. It was insulation. The deep drift against her wall was a blanket provided by the storm itself, adding another layer of protection. She would check on Juniper in her lean-to. The mare was hardy, her winter coat thick. The small shelter kept the wind off her, and Clara made sure she had fresh water, melted from snow on the stovetop, and a ration of the oats Silas Porter had given her. The horse's steady, munching presence was a vital sign, a confirmation of life beyond her own. Her days were governed by the mathematics of survival. She measured her fuel consumption carefully, noting in the margins of Elias's journal how many logs it took to keep the temperature stable. She discovered that the granite's thermal mass was even more effective than she had hoped. After hours of the stove running, the rock itself would be warm to the touch, and it would continue to radiate a gentle heat for hours after the fire was banked for the night. This meant she could use less wood than she had initially calculated. Food was rationed with equal care. A cup of flour for flatbread, a handful of beans, a small piece of salt pork. Coffee was a luxury, brewed once in the morning. Water came from melting the clean, deep snow from the upper drifts. It was a monotonous diet, but it was fuel for the engine of her body. In the long hours of the afternoon, when the light failed and the storm raged, she would read Elias's geology texts by the light of a kerosene lamp. She was not just passing the time. She was studying, learning the language of the rocks that surrounded her, understanding the deep forces that had shaped her refuge. On the 6th day, the storm broke, the wind died, and a profound, crystalline silence fell over the landscape. Clara stepped outside into a world transformed. The snow was 6 feet deep on the level ground, sculpted by the wind into fantastic dunes and drifts. The sky was a fierce, painful blue, and the sun on the snow was blinding. Her shelter was almost completely buried, only the top of her wall and the stovepipe visible. A tunnel of snow was now her entrance. She looked out over the vast, white wilderness. There was no sign of human life, no smoke from the chimneys in Argent, nothing. She was utterly alone, but she was not afraid. She was warm. She had food. She had fuel. The shelter had worked. Her engineering, learned from a dead man's journal and executed with her own 2 hands, had held against the worst the winter could throw at it. She had survived the first test. Word of the widow on Sentinel Ridge traveled slowly, carried like a seed on the winter wind. It started with Silas Porter. A week after the great storm, he rode as far as the Argent Creek Ford on his sturdiest horse, then made the rest of the journey on snowshoes, a pack on his back. He was worried. No one in Argent had seen or heard from Clara since before the blizzard. The common assumption was that she had taken her settlement money and gone to Denver. But Silas knew better. He had sold her the tools. He found her shelter by the thin plume of smoke rising from the snow-covered ridge. He was stunned by what he saw. The dry stack wall was a piece of master craftsmanship, solid and true. The interior was snug, warm, and impeccably organized. He looked at her immense woodpile, her neat stores of food, and the calm, steady look in her eyes. He had come expecting to perform a rescue. He found instead a lesson in competence. "By God, Clara," he said, his voice filled with a gruff respect. Elias himself couldn't have built it better. He had brought her a sack of potatoes, a small wheel of cheese, and news from town. The storm had been hard on Argent. Several families in the less sturdy cabins on the edge of town were struggling. The miller's roof had partially collapsed under the snow load. The widow Jensen had nearly run out of firewood. The company houses were warm enough, but the independent families were suffering. The story Silas told back in Argent became a small legend. The woman who had been cast out was not only surviving, she was thriving. At first there was disbelief, then a grudging respect. Then, as the winter deepened and the cold tightened its grip, people began to seek her out. The first to come were the Miller family. John Miller appeared at her snow tunnel one afternoon, his face etched with worry. His youngest child was sick with a lung-rattling cough, and their cabin was perpetually cold. He had heard that she knew something about staying warm. Clara did not gloat. She did not remind him that he and his wife had turned their heads when she passed them in the street after the eviction. She saw only the desperation of a father trying to protect his child. She invited him into the warmth of her shelter, gave him a mug of hot coffee, and she listened. Then she began to teach. She didn't just give him firewood, though she sent him away with a generous armload of her own seasoned pine. She drew diagrams in the packed snow of her floor with a stick. She explained the principle of the thermal mass of stone, the importance of a southern exposure. She told him how to bank snow against the north wall of his own cabin to use it as insulation. She explained how to use mud and moss to seal the drafts around his windows and doors. She gave him knowledge, not charity. Others followed. The widow Jensen came, and Clara showed her how to build a simple rocket stove from scavenged bricks and tin cans, a design that burned small branches and twigs with incredible efficiency. Two young miners, whose fuel supply had been mismanaged, came to ask for advice on felling and seasoning deadfall timber. She became an unlikely consultant, her shelter a classroom. People who had once pitied her or ignored her now came to her for her expertise. They saw the evidence of her skill all around them, in the solid walls, the immense woodpile, the steady warmth radiating from her stove. She was no longer just the widow Holloway. She was the woman on the ridge, the one who understood the cold and knew how to defeat it. Her vindication was not a matter of law or money. It was practical, earned, and shared freely with the very community that had allowed her to be cast aside. In late January, the Gilded Spur Mining Company's operations on Sentinel Ridge ran into a series of catastrophic problems. A ventilation shaft in their new primary tunnel collapsed, trapping a crew for 6 hours. A week later, a section of the main drift began to flood from an unforeseen aquifer. The company's engineers, men with degrees from Eastern schools, were baffled. Their geological surveys had shown the rock to be stable. Their projections were wrong, and the errors were costing the company thousands of dollars a day in lost productivity and repairs. In desperation, the superintendent, Mr. Thorne, hired an independent consulting geologist from Denver to assess the situation. His name was Arthur Arkwright, a quiet, methodical man in his 40s, with a national reputation for solving difficult geological puzzles. Arkwright spent a week examining the company's mines, core samples, and survey maps. He quickly concluded that their understanding of the local geology was fundamentally flawed. They were drilling through a complex formation of faulted granite and schist that their maps failed to show. While in Argent, Arkwright heard the stories of the woman living in a cave on the south face of the ridge. The tales were told with a mixture of awe and local pride. They said she had built a house of stone that was warmer than any cabin in town. Intrigued by this local curiosity, and suspecting that anyone living so intimately with the rock might have something to teach him, he hired a guide and made the trek to her shelter. He arrived to find Clara splitting firewood with a practiced, efficient rhythm. She stopped when she saw him, her expression wary but not hostile. Arkwright introduced himself, explaining his purpose with a straightforward professionalism that she appreciated. He asked if he might see what she had built. Clara led him inside. Arkwright's eyes, trained to assess structure and material, took in every detail. He ran his hand over the dry stack wall, noting the precision of the fit. He examined the stove installation, the clever use of the natural fissure as a flue. He used the technical language of his profession, speaking almost to himself. Remarkable, a near-perfect application of passive solar design, and the thermal efficiency of this granite mass. It's extraordinary. His gaze then fell upon the western wall, and the glittering vein of quartz and argentite that she had left exposed. He stopped dead. He walked over and examined it closely, pulling a small geologist's loupe from his pocket. "Good heavens," he breathed. "That's an exceptionally rich seam of argentite. Where did you find this?" "It was here when I came," Clara said simply. "My husband noted it in his journals." Arkwright's head snapped up. "Your husband was Elias Holloway?" Clara nodded. I knew his work by reputation, Arkwright said, his voice filled with a new level of respect. He published a paper on the metamorphic formations of this region. Might I see his journals? Clara retrieved the leather-bound ledger. Arkwright handled it with a reverence she understood completely. He turned the pages, his eyes scanning Elias's precise script and detailed sketches. He found the entry for Elias's folly. He read it, then read it again. He looked from the journal to the vein in the wall, then back to the journal. A look of dawning comprehension spread across his face. Mrs. Holloway, he said slowly, your husband wasn't just a prospector. He was a brilliant geologist. This journal, this is a complete geological survey of the South Ridge. It documents the very fault lines and intrusions my colleagues have missed. He saw it all. The instability, the water tables, it's all here. He looked at her, his professional excitement tempered by the gravity of the situation. The Gilded Spur evicted you from your home, he stated, not as a question, but as a fact he was piecing together. They did it because they believed their claim to this ridge was absolute, based on their own flawed surveys. But this journal proves prior discovery, not just of this small seam, but of the entire geological context that governs this ridge. This document, Mrs. Holloway, is not just a notebook. It is evidence. It is, in its own way, a deed. The expert's recognition was not what gave her work value. She knew its value in her bones, in the warmth of her shelter against the winter night. But his words opened a door back into the world that had cast her out, but on her own terms. He saw what she had done, not as a desperate act of survival, but as a feat of applied engineering. And he saw what Elias had left her, not as a curiosity, but as a legal and scientific claim. The reckoning was about to begin. Arthur Arkwright returned to the Gilded Spur Mining Company's office in Argent, Elias Holloway's journal tucked securely in his satchel. He requested an immediate meeting with Superintendent Thorne. In the cold, formal office, surrounded by the company's inadequate maps, Arkwright laid out his findings. He did not speak of morality or cruelty. He spoke the language the company understood: geology, engineering, and financial liability. He explained that the company's mine was structurally unsound because it was built on a profound ignorance of the local rock. He then opened Elias's journal and showed Thorne the detailed sketches, the precise measurements, the dated entries that predated the company's own surveys by more than a year. He pointed to the entry on the unstable schist, the notes on the aquifer that was now flooding their tunnels. It was all there. Elias Holloway had done their work for them, and they had been too arrogant to know it. This journal, Arkwright concluded, his voice calm and authoritative, constitutes a prior claim based on documented discovery, not just to the silver seam in his wife's shelter, but to the intellectual property of the Geological Survey itself. Mrs. Holloway is in possession of the key to mining this ridge safely and profitably. Without it, you will continue to have collapses and floods. It is my professional opinion that you are legally and financially exposed. Thorne, a man accustomed to wielding absolute power in his small domain, was pale. He saw the potential for lawsuits from injured miners, for investigations from federal regulators, for the ruinous expense of trying to engineer a solution they did not understand. He saw that the widow he had dismissed with a $65 settlement now held the future of his operation in her hands. The company's offer came 2 days later, delivered not by a nervous young clerk, but by Arkwright himself. He rode up to the shelter and sat with Clara by her stove, laying out the terms. The Gilded Spur offered to buy the rights to Elias's journals and the mining claim they represented. They also offered a full public apology and the deed to her former house in town, free and clear. The price they were willing to pay for the knowledge was $15,000. It was a fortune, an amount of money that could change a life completely. Clara listened without expression. The money was a tool, a means to an end. The house was a symbol, but neither could replace what had been lost. The years with Elias, the peace that had been stolen. The cost of her survival was written in the calluses on her hands and the solitary months etched into her memory. "There is one more condition," she said, her voice steady. "The man who managed the Argent office, the one who signed my eviction notice, he is to be dismissed." Arkwright nodded. "That has already been done." She accepted the offer. The transaction was handled through a Denver lawyer Arkwright recommended. The money was deposited in a bank. The deed was placed in her name. The local manager who had treated her with such casual disdain was fired and left town in disgrace. The reckoning was quiet, administrative, a series of papers changing hands. There was no triumphalism, no celebration. Justice, she found, was a colder and more practical affair than revenge. She did not move back into the house in town immediately. Instead, she used a portion of the money to buy Porter's Mercantile when Silas decided to retire that spring. She ran the store with the same quiet competence and practical wisdom she had applied to her own survival. She became a pillar of the community, the one people turned to not just for supplies, but for advice on how to weather the hardships of the high country. But she never abandoned the shelter on Sentinel Ridge. Every autumn, before the first snow, she would ride Juniper up the trail and spend a week stalking it. She would add to the woodpile, check the seals on the stovepipe, and ensure the stone walls were sound. The place remained hers, kept ready, a testament to her own resilience. It was a reminder that she would never again be dependent on the whims of a company or the fickle goodwill of a town. She had not been rescued. She had rescued herself. The shelter was not a monument to her suffering, but to her strength. She was Clara Holloway, the woman who had faced the cold, the cruelty, and the calculation, and had met them all with her own. She was 21. And by the cold measure of the world, she was homeless. Her uncle, Silas Blackwood, a man who measured everything in columns of figures, had declared her a debt, and for that, she was dismissed. She had no family left to turn to, no plan, and just $10 in a worn leather purse. And with 4 of those dollars, she would soon buy a locked and abandoned railroad car sitting on a dead-end siding in the Wyoming high country. It was a purchase of quiet desperation, a foolish grasp at owning something, anything at all. But what no one knew, what she could not possibly imagine, was that sealed inside that rusted iron box was a 30-year-old secret, a payroll and a leather-bound ledger that held the truth about the man who had cast her out, a truth that would not just change her life, but resurrect a town left for dead. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nell Ashby. If you're watching from a place that feels forgotten, let us know in the comments below. Nell's education had come not in a schoolhouse, but in the ringing darkness of her father's smithy. John Ashby had been a railroad blacksmith, a man whose language was the color of hot steel and the percussive grammar of a hammer on an anvil. He had loved 2 things without reservation: his daughter and the elegant physics of his work. From the time she was old enough to stand near the forge without flinching, he had taught her. He taught her the names of tools not as a list to be memorized, but as a litany of purpose. The ball peen for riveting, the cross peen for drawing out, the straight peen for stretching. He taught her to read the temper of metal in its shades of straw yellow, peacock blue, and dove gray. "Everything has a grain, Nell," he would say, his voice a low rumble beneath the hiss of the slack tub. Wood, steel, even people. You learn to work with it, not against it, and it will bend to your will. Fight it, and it will break, or it will break you. She learned the heft and balance of his favorite hammer, a small 2-pound cross peen with a hickory handle worn smooth and dark by the sweat and oil of his hand. It was an extension of him, and in her small hands, it felt like holding his strength. When she was 17, a sickness of the lungs that the doctor called consumption took her father quickly, leaving the forge cold and silent. Her uncle, Silas Blackwood, her father's estranged older brother, arrived from his prosperous town of Blackwood Station to handle the arrangements. Silas was the inverse of his brother. Where John had been forged of iron and soot, Silas was constructed of paper and ink. He was a banker, a founder, a man who had built his town on land acquired through shrewd, unsmiling transactions. He saw his brother's forge not as a place of craft, but as a poorly performing asset. He sold it, along with the house and tools, for a sum that seemed insultingly small to Nell. He then took her in, not with warmth, but with the air of a man accepting a necessary, if inconvenient, inheritance. For 4 years, she lived in his large, quiet house, a ghost in the halls of his prosperity. She was given chores, a small room, and a seat at the dinner table where the conversation was always of ledgers, interest rates, and freight costs. Silas never spoke of her father, and when Nell once brought him up, her uncle had simply looked at her with his cool, gray eyes and said, "Your father did not understand the world as it is, Nell. He saw value in sentiment. There is no column for that in a balance sheet." In those 4 years, the only thing she had left of her father was the small cross-peen hammer, which she had wrapped in oilcloth and hidden at the bottom of her trunk. It was the one piece of him Silas had overlooked, a thing of no monetary value, an object whose only worth was in sentiment. The end of her time in Blackwood Station came as quietly as it had begun. On the morning of her 21st birthday, her uncle did not wish her well. Instead, he summoned her to his office, a room that smelled of dry paper and leather-bound books. He sat behind his wide oak desk, a sheaf of papers squared perfectly before him. He did not ask her to sit. "Nell," he began, his voice flat and administrative, "you have reached the age of majority. As such, the matter of your keep must be settled." He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished wood. It was an invoice. He had calculated the cost of her food, her lodging, her clothing for 4 years, down to the penny. The total was a staggering sum, more money than she had ever seen or imagined. "This is what your maintenance has cost my household," he said. She stared at the number, feeling the air leave her lungs. It was a debt she could never repay. It was a cage made of ink. "However," he continued, steepling his fingers, "I am not an unreasonable man. I am prepared to forgive this debt in its entirety. In exchange, you will accept a train ticket to any destination west of here and a stipend of $10 for your relocation." He pushed a ticket and 2 $5 bills next to the invoice. It was not an offer. It was a verdict. There was no room for argument, no space for appeal. She had been a line item in his ledger, and he was now closing the account. She looked at his face, as smooth and unreadable as a river stone, and saw no flicker of family, no memory of his brother. She simply saw a man balancing his books. "I understand," she said, her voice steady. She took the ticket and the money. She did not take the invoice. She left it lying on the desk, a testament to his particular brand of cruelty. She went to her room, packed her small trunk with her few dresses, her mother's locket, and at the very bottom, wrapped in its oilcloth, her father's hammer. An hour later, she was standing on the platform of the Blackwood Station depot, the whistle of the westbound train screaming its arrival. She did not look back at the town that bore her uncle's name. She simply gathered her things and moved toward her new life, a life that began with a debt she did not owe and $10 she had not earned. The journey was a lesson in diminishment. The train pulled out of Blackwood Station, a place of painted clapboard, tidy streets, and the palpable hum of commerce, all of it a monument to Silas Blackwood's ambition. Nell sat on the hard wooden bench of the passenger car, her trunk at her feet, and watched the world she knew recede. For the first hour, the landscape was one of managed prosperity, fenced pastures, herds of fat cattle, and neat farmhouses with smoke curling from their chimneys. But as the train chugged westward, the land began to change. The green softened to pale ochre, the rolling hills flattened into an immense high plain, and the trees grew sparse, clinging to the dry creek beds like stubborn afterthoughts. The air that came through the open window was no longer sweet with hay and damp earth, but thin, dry, and scented with sage and dust. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the rails was a constant, hypnotic drumbeat, marking her passage from a place of cold comfort to one of absolute uncertainty. She was moving not just across a landscape, but through the strata of fortune. The other passengers thinned out at each stop, leaving for small homesteads or dusty cattle towns until the car was nearly empty. By the second day, the train was a small, loud thing moving through a vast and silent emptiness. The sky was immense, a pale, washed-out blue that seemed to press down on the land. In the distance, the sharp, purple teeth of the mountains serrated the horizon, a destination that felt impossibly far. Her ticket was for a town called Rawlins, but a conversation overheard between the conductor and a brakeman had caught her ear. They spoke of a siding called Caldera Spur, a place where the railroad was auctioning off abandoned stock and equipment. Selling it for scrap, the conductor had said with a shrug. The spur's been dead for 20 years. Cheaper to sell it than to haul it out. An idea, fragile and uncertain, began to form in Nell's mind. Owning something, even if it was just scrap. When the train slowed for a water stop at a desolate junction, a place with no name but a water tower and a telegraph shed, she made her decision. She found the conductor. "I'd like to get off at Caldera Spur," she said. He looked at her, then at her simple dress and small trunk, his expression a mixture of pity and disbelief. "Ain't nothing there, miss. Nothing at all." "I'm aware," Nell said. "I'm meeting someone." It was a lie, but it was enough. He shrugged and pulled the signal cord. The train groaned to a halt beside a short, weed-choked siding. A weathered sign, its letters peeling, read, Caldera Spur. There was no station, no platform, just two long, rusted tracks branching off from the main line and disappearing into the sagebrush. The brakeman swung her trunk down onto the dusty ground. The train hissed, groaned, and began to pull away, leaving her utterly alone in the immense silence of the high plains, with the wind pulling at her hair and the sun beating down on her head. Caldera Spur was not a ghost town. It was the ghost of a town's ambition. All that remained were a dozen sun-bleached structures huddled together as if for warmth against the ceaseless wind. A failed general store with boarded-up windows, a livery stable whose roof had collapsed into a skeleton of rafters, and a handful of small, salt-box houses slowly surrendering to the elements. The spur line itself ran past these buildings to a flat, dusty yard where the auction was taking place. A small crowd of perhaps 20 men, ranchers and scavengers with sun-cracked faces and wary eyes, stood listening to a tired-looking auctioneer in a sweat-stained hat. He was gesturing to a pile of rusted rails and splintered ties. "Sold for $3.50 to the man in the blue shirt," he called out, his voice thin in the open air. Nell walked toward the group, her trunk held in one hand, feeling the weight of their collective gaze. She was an anomaly, a young woman alone in a place of men and decay. She ignored them, her attention drawn to the items for sale. There were flat cars loaded with rotting lumber, A tender car stripped of its brass fittings, and at the very end of the line, a single, hulking boxcar. It was a Class B-40 baggage car, built of heavy oak and reinforced with thick iron plating. Its paint, once a proud crimson of the Wyoming and Pacific Line, had faded to a mottled, rust-colored blush. Unlike the other cars, this one was sealed. Its heavy sliding door was not just locked, but riveted shut, with a thick, ugly weld bead running along the seam where the door met the frame. It sat there like a locked strongbox, inscrutable and immense. A piece of paper, brittle and yellowed, was tacked to the wood beside the door. It was the auction lot description. Lot 73, she read. 1-1 Class B-40 boxcar. Contents unknown. Sold as is, where is. Buyer responsible for removal. The auctioneer moved down the line, his patter growing more desperate as he tried to sell off the dregs of the railroad's forgotten property. When he reached the boxcar, he barely gave it a glance. All right, folks, Lot 73, one sealed baggage car. We don't know what's in it. Probably 30 years of dust and spiders. We can't open it, and we ain't gonna try. We'll start the bidding at $5 for the scrap iron. Silence. The men looked at the car, then at each other, and shook their heads. The cost of cutting it open and hauling it away would be more than the scrap was worth. $5, gentlemen? $4 for the iron? The auctioneer's gaze swept the small crowd and landed on Nell. He seemed about to move on, but she raised her hand, a small, hesitant gesture. I'll bid $4, she said, her voice clear and steady. A few of the men chuckled. The auctioneer's eyebrows went up. $4 from the young lady. Do I hear 4 1/4? $4 once, twice. Sold. For $4 to the lady in the gray dress. He banged a small gavel on a railway tie. He looked at her, a wry smile on his face. Congratulations, miss. She's all yours. Just as soon as you figure out how to move her. He laughed, and the other men joined in. Nell ignored them. She walked to the auctioneer's table, opened her purse and counted out 4 of her 10 remaining dollars. She took the bill of sale, a simple handwritten receipt. She was now the owner of a locked iron box she couldn't open, in a town that didn't exist, with $6 to her name. She walked back to the car, laid her hand against the sun-warmed, rusted metal, and felt the first terrifying thrill of ownership. The first challenge was not opening the car, but surviving long enough to try. The wind grew colder as the sun dipped toward the mountains, and Nell knew she could not spend the night in the open. She explored the derelict town, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She found one building that was more intact than the others, a small boarding house with a sign that read, "The Caldera Rest." Most of its windows were broken, but one room at the back was weather-tight, its glass still in place. Inside, there was a simple iron bed frame, a rickety table, and a small wood stove, its pipe rusted but whole. This would be her shelter. Her second discovery was a well behind the house with a functioning hand pump. The water that came up was cold and sweet, tasting of iron and deep earth. With water and shelter secured, her focus returned to the boxcar. She walked its length, studying the problem. The door was sealed by a thick, crude weld, a bead of iron laid down 30 years ago by a hand that had clearly intended it to be permanent. Beneath the weld, she could see the heads of heavy rivets. To open it would require tools she did not have: a heavy sledge, a cold chisel, and a great deal of time. Her father's hammer was a fine tool for shaping, but it was no brute instrument of destruction. She spent the next day scavenging. In the collapsed livery stable under a pile of rotted hay, she found a set of rusted but serviceable tongs and a cracked anvil head. In the abandoned general store, she found a barrel of coal, dusty but still combustible. She was gathering the components of a forge. That evening, a man approached her small, makeshift camp. He was old, with a back bent from a lifetime of labor and hands like gnarled oak. He introduced himself as Jedediah, a retired Gandhi dancer who had worked the original line and now lived alone in one of the few other habitable shacks, surviving on a small railroad pension and his own resilience. "Saw you at the auction," he said, his voice raspy. "Bought yourself a puzzle." "I did," Nell replied, not wasting words. "You aim to open it?" "I do." He watched her for a long moment, his pale blue eyes taking in her meager setup, the small hammer she was cleaning by the fire, the determination in her posture. "You'll need more than that little pecker," he said, gesturing to her father's hammer. "You need a striking hammer and a good chisel." He saw the flicker of disappointment in her eyes. She had no money to buy such things, and no one to borrow from. He chewed on his lip, then seemed to come to a decision. "I got a sledge and a set of hardies and chisels. Belonged to the crew boss. Left 'em when the spur closed." He paused. "You can use them, if you'll share whatever's in that boxcar, if it's anything more than spiders." It was a fair offer, a partnership born of mutual necessity. "Agreed," Nell said. The next morning, Jedediah returned with a 12-pound sledgehammer, its handle smooth with age, and a canvas roll that held a series of heavy, tempered steel chisels. The work began. Nell knew from her father that she couldn't simply smash her way in. She needed to attack the weld. Using the tongs and her makeshift forge, she heated a chisel to a bright cherry red, then used her father's hammer to refine its edge, giving it the perfect angle to bite into the old weld. It was work her father had taught her, the careful marriage of heat and force. Jedediah watched, his initial skepticism turning to quiet respect. "You've held a hammer before?" he observed. "My father was a blacksmith," she said, not looking up from her work. For 3 days they labored. Jedediah, his old muscles protesting, would swing the heavy sledge, driving the chisel that Nell held steady against the weld. The sound was a deafening, rhythmic clang that echoed across the empty plains. Clang! A chip of rust flew. Clang! A small groove appeared. Clang! It was brutal, exhausting work. Each evening they would stop, their bodies aching, and Nell would repair the blunted edge of the chisel at her forge. On the 4th day, with a final resonant blow from the sledge, the weld bead cracked. A line of darkness appeared. With a pry bar they'd found, they wedged it into the crack and heaved. The metal groaned, screeched, and then, with a shudder that ran through the whole car, the door broke free. The door slid open with the shriek of tortured metal, revealing a rectangle of absolute darkness. A wave of air, stale and dead for 3 decades, washed over them. It smelled of dry rot, dust, and something else. A faint, metallic tang. They let the interior air out for a long while before Jedediah lit a lantern. He held it high, and they peered inside. The light cut through the gloom, illuminating a scene frozen in time. The car was not empty. It was filled with wooden crates, neatly stacked and bound with iron straps. But their attention was immediately drawn to the center of the car. There, bolted to the floor, was a large iron strongbox, about 3 feet square, its surface covered in a fine layer of dust. And beside it, lying on its side, was the skeleton of a man. He was dressed in the tattered remains of a railroad paymaster's uniform. One skeletal hand rested on the strongbox, as if in a final protective gesture. "Lord have mercy," Jedediah whispered, taking off his hat. They stood in silence for a moment, paying their respects to the unknown man who had been sealed in this tomb. Nell's gaze was methodical. She noted the heavy-duty lock on the strongbox, and then something else. Near the dead man's other hand was a small leather-bound book, almost lost in the shadows. A ledger. She stepped carefully into the car, her boots stirring up clouds of dust that danced in the lantern light. She picked up the book. Its cover was stiff, the leather dry and cracked. She opened it. The first page was a paymaster's log, the entries written in a neat, precise hand. Wyoming and Pacific Line, it read. Payroll shipment, August 12, 1855. Paymaster, Elias Vance. The name meant nothing to them, but as she turned the pages, she saw lists of names, towns, and amounts owed. Wages for hundreds of men who had built the very line they now stood upon. She tucked the ledger under her arm and turned her attention to the strongbox. The lock was formidable, but Nell, trained by a man who worked with metal, saw not an obstacle, but another puzzle. It was a tumbler lock, and she could see the faint outline of its internal mechanism through the keyhole. It would be impossible to pick. But there was another way. The hinges, she said to Jedediah. They're on the outside. The hinges were thick straps of iron, held in place by heavy rivets. It would be the same work as the door, only finer. For another day they worked, this time with smaller chisels and Nell's own hammer. She directed the placement of the chisel with pinpoint accuracy, shearing the heads off the rivets one by one. Finally, the last rivet head flew off, and the hinge strap came loose. They pried open the heavy lid. Inside, nestled in velvet-lined compartments, were stacks of gold coins. Double eagles, glistening in the lantern light as if they were minted yesterday. It was a fortune. The entire payroll for the central division of the railroad. Jedediah stared, his breath catching in his throat. But Nell was looking for something else. Tucked into the ledger she had retrieved was a folded sealed envelope. On it was written, in the same neat hand, "To whoever finds this." She broke the seal. The letter inside was from Elias Vance, the paymaster. He wrote that on the night of the shipment, the train had been stopped by masked men, but he had grown suspicious. The robbery was too convenient, the location too perfect. He recognized the voice of the lead robber as one of the railroad's own executives. Realizing he was being set up to take the fall for a staged theft, he had locked himself in the baggage car, refusing to open it. In his last hours, as the robbers gave up and decided to abandon the car on a forgotten spur, he used a portable forge and welder from the tool crate, part of the shipment, to seal the door from the inside. His final words were a plea. "The man who orchestrated this is Silas Blackwood, the vice president of land acquisition," he wrote. "He means to use this stolen capital to buy the very land the railroad has made valuable, bankrupting the company and cheating the men who built it. The proof of his scheme is in this ledger, in the discrepancies between the official books and the funds I carry. Do not let this theft stand. See that the men are paid. See that justice is done. My life is forfeit, but the truth must not be." Nell held the letter, her hand trembling. Silas Blackwood, her uncle, the foundation of his fortune, his town, his entire life was built upon this 30-year-old crime, sealed in a tomb with a dead man's integrity. The revelation settled over the small, dusty room in the boarding house not with a shout, but with a heavy, profound silence. Nell, Jedediah, and Martha, the stout, no-nonsense widow who ran the town's de facto community hub from her small, tidy kitchen, sat around a rough-hewn table. The lantern cast a warm, golden light on the open ledger and Elias Vance's final letter. The gold coins remained in the boxcar, a secondary concern to the explosive truth contained in the paymaster's meticulous script. Martha, who had arrived with a pot of strong coffee and a loaf of fresh bread upon hearing the news from Jedediah, read the letter a second time, her lips moving silently. She had been a girl when Caldera Spur had died, but she remembered the stories. She remembered the railroad pulling out, the promises of prosperity turning to dust, the families who had packed up and left with nothing. "Silas Blackwood," she said, her voice filled with a low, simmering anger. "I remember his name. He came through here once before the collapse. A man in a fine suit, promising everyone the moon, said the spur line would make this valley the next Denver." Jedediah nodded, his gnarled fingers tracing the list of names in the ledger. These men, I knew some of them. Good men. Foremen, engineers, Gandhi dancers. They were told the payroll was robbed. The company was broke. They were sent away with pennies on the dollar for a season's hard labor. He looked at Nell. Your uncle didn't just steal money. He stole this town's future. The weight of the discovery was immense. They possessed the evidence to ruin one of the most powerful men in the territory. But as Nell looked at the faces of her new, unlikely allies, she knew a public accusation was not the way. Silas Blackwood had 30 years of entrenched power, lawyers, and influence. A girl with a ledger found in a rusted boxcar would be dismissed, discredited, and destroyed. The truth needed a different kind of weapon. Her father's words came back to her. You learned to work with the grain, not against it. The grain of this situation was not confrontation, but restoration. We don't go to the law, Nell said, her voice quiet but firm. We don't go to the newspapers. We do what Elias Vance asked. We see that the men are paid. Martha and Jedediah looked at her, confused. Most of these men are dead or gone, girl, Jedediah said gently. It's been 30 years. But their families aren't, Nell countered, tapping the ledger. Vance didn't just record names. He recorded their hometowns. Anson, Kansas, Kearney, Nebraska. Here, she pointed. A foreman, Michael O'Connell, lived right here in Caldera Spur. Martha's eyes widened. The O'Connell place. It's abandoned now. But his granddaughter Elspeth still lives in the valley. She's a seamstress, a widow with 2 boys. A plan began to form, not of vengeance, but of meticulous, undeniable justice. The rebuilding would not be of a house, but of a debt. They would use the gold not as a treasure to be spent, but as a tool of restitution. They would follow the trail laid out in the ledger, find the descendants of the men Blackwood had cheated, and pay them the wages they were owed. Each payment would be a quiet testament to the truth, a seed of Blackwood's undoing planted not in the courts, but in the communities he had impoverished. The work would be slow, painstaking, and powerful. It was a blacksmith's approach to justice, patient, precise, and transformative. The process of settling the 30-year-old debt began the next morning. It was a task that required more than just gold. It required care, dignity, and a deep respect for the past. Nell, with Jedediah at her side for credibility and Martha for her deep knowledge of the valley's families, made their first visit. They rode a borrowed wagon to a small, weathered cabin on the far side of the valley, where Elspeth O'Connell lived. She was a woman in her 40s, with tired eyes and hands raw from hard work, who greeted them with wary politeness. Nell did not begin with the story of Silas Blackwood or the stolen gold. She began with Elspeth's grandfather. Mrs. O'Connell, Nell started, her voice gentle, we're here on behalf of the Wyoming and Pacific Railroad. We've come to settle a debt owed to your grandfather, Michael O'Connell, for his work as foreman in the summer of 1855. She presented the ledger, opened to the page where Michael O'Connell's name was clearly written, along with his wages, $180. Elspeth stared at the book, her brow furrowed in confusion. My grandmother told me the railroad went bankrupt, that the payroll was stolen. That was the story, Nell said carefully. But the payroll was not stolen. It was misplaced, and it has now been recovered. She placed a small, heavy canvas bag on the table. Inside, counted out precisely according to the ledger, was the $180 in gold coin, plus a carefully calculated amount for 30 years of interest, a figure Nell had spent half the night computing. This is what he was owed, Nell said. Elspeth opened the bag, her hands trembling as she stared at the gleaming coins. It was more money than she had seen in her life. It was enough to buy new boots for her sons, to fix her leaky roof, to purchase seed for a spring planting. Tears welled in her eyes, not just for the money, but for the unexpected validation of her family's long-held grievance. He always said they were cheated, she whispered. My grandmother died believing it. Before they left, Nell had her sign a receipt, a simple document stating she had received the wages due to Michael O'Connell. It was a crucial part of the plan, another piece of paper to counter Silas Blackwood's empire of paper. News of the payment traveled through the valley, not on the wind, but through quiet, deliberate conversations. A week later, when Nell and Jedediah paid the debt owed to the grandson of a stonemason, the man had already heard the story from Elspeth's cousin. He accepted the money with solemn gratitude and signed the receipt without question. They found others. The daughter of a brakeman, now running a small bakery in a neighboring town. The nephew of a surveyor, who had become the local blacksmith. With each payment, the story grew, solidifying from rumor into documented fact. The community of Caldera Spur, long dormant, began to stir. The infusion of capital was like a spring rain on parched ground. The blacksmith bought a new shipment of iron. Elspeth O'Connell hired a man to repair her roof. The general store in the next town over began making deliveries to Caldera Spur again. People began to talk of rebuilding, of reopening the old schoolhouse. Nell Ashby was no longer the strange girl who bought a rusted boxcar. She was the quiet woman who was making things right. She never spoke her uncle's name. She didn't have to. The ledger, the gold, and the growing stack of signed receipts spoke for her, weaving a narrative of truth more powerful than any accusation. Nell's life settled into a new rhythm, dictated by the ledger and the needs of the nascent community. She moved out of the derelict boarding house and into the boxcar itself. With the help of Jedediah and the town's new blacksmith, a young man named Ben whose grandfather's wages Nell had paid, they transformed the iron shell into a home and an office. They cut windows into the thick walls, installed a proper floor over the iron-plated base, and built a small, efficient stove that kept the space warm against the Wyoming winds. The boxcar, once a tomb and a symbol of abandonment, became the functional and symbolic heart of the reborn Caldera Spur. Her desk was a simple plank of pine set on 2 barrels, but on it lay the instruments of her new authority. The paymaster's ledger, a neat stack of signed receipts, and an account book of her own where she tracked every dollar paid out. Her father's small cross-peen hammer sat on a stack of papers, its worn handle a constant grounding presence. She was not a lady of leisure, dispensing charity. She was a steward, a position she earned every day. She worked. When the ledger work was done, she helped Martha plant a communal garden, her hands deep in the same dark soil her payments were helping to enrich. She helped Ben at the forge, her old skills returning with a satisfying familiarity as she sharpened plowshares and repaired wagon wheels. People no longer saw her as an outsider. They simply knew her as Nell. Her name was spoken with a quiet respect in the slowly reviving town. Small rituals formed. Every morning, Jedediah would bring her a cup of coffee. Every evening, Martha would send over one of Elspeth's boys with a plate of hot food. The town was becoming a web of these small, reciprocal kindnesses, the true currency of a community. The news of Caldera Spur's revival, and the strange story of its benefactor, eventually traveled the 100 miles east to Blackwood Station. It arrived not as a formal report, but as whispers among freight haulers and traveling merchants. They spoke of a woman paying 30-year-old railroad debts in gold. They spoke of a ledger. Silas Blackwood heard the whispers, and he understood. He knew whose ledger it was. He knew whose gold it was, but he was trapped. To deny the payments would be to call men like Elias Vance liars. To challenge Nell would be to draw public attention to the very crime he had so carefully buried. He was being undone not by a frontal assault, but by the slow, inexorable pressure of his own history, brought to light by the one person he had so carelessly discarded. His power, built on a foundation of stolen money and paper lies, began to erode. Creditors grew wary, partners grew distant. The empire of paper began to dissolve under the weight of a single, unassailable truth. Nell never saw her uncle again. She heard, months later, that he had sold his bank and his holdings for a fraction of their supposed worth and moved away, disappearing from the territory he had once sought to dominate. He was not defeated in a dramatic confrontation, but simply rendered irrelevant by an act of quiet, persistent integrity. Nell stood in the open doorway of her boxcar home, a mug of coffee warming her hands. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley, and the air was crisp and clean. From where she stood, she could see the signs of life, small but steady. A new roof on the old livery, the wood still pale and smelling of pine. A thread of smoke rising from the chimney of the blacksmith's shop, followed by the faint, rhythmic music of a hammer on steel. 2 children, Elspeth O'Connell's boys, chasing a dog through the sagebrush. This was the world that $4 and a dead man's promise had built. She had not become rich. After the final debt was paid to a distant cousin in Oregon, tracked down through a series of letters, the gold was nearly gone. What remained was not a treasure, but a town, a community, a place to belong. She turned back inside and looked at her desk. The paymaster's ledger lay open, its pages filled with the elegant script of Elias Vance, a man she had never met, but whose quiet courage had become the blueprint for her own life. Next to it sat her father's hammer. She picked it up, the hickory handle a familiar comfort in her palm. It was a tool for building, for shaping, for making things strong and true. Her father had taught her the nature of steel, how to work with its grain to create something useful and lasting. Elias Vance had done the same with his ledger, arranging names and numbers into a tool of unimpeachable truth. And she, in her own way, had taken up their work. She had used the ledger and the gold not to enrich herself, but to forge a community, to mend a 30-year-old break. She thought of Silas Blackwood, a man who saw the world only in columns of profit and loss, who had dismissed her as a valueless asset. He had tried to break her, but like a piece of well-tempered steel she had bent, and then she had held her shape. He had cast her out with nothing, but in doing so he had given her everything. The boxcar, the town, the purpose. She was Nell Ashby. She was 21 years old and had been cast out with $10 to her name. She spent 4 of those dollars on a locked iron box no one wanted, sitting on a forgotten track in the middle of nowhere. It was the best $4 she ever spent. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet resilience and unexpected justice. The world is full of things that have been overlooked, abandoned, or dismissed as worthless. We hope Nell's story serves as a reminder that sometimes the greatest value is hidden right beneath the surface, waiting for a patient hand and a seeing eye. If you enjoyed our story, please consider sharing it with someone who appreciates the quiet strength of those who build and restore. And for our question today, what is a time in your life when you found unexpected value in something or someone that others had written off? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.